Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Scott Stirrett, founder and CEO of Venture for Canada, and your host. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In season 3, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. I'm excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive. Daniel Debow is a VP product at Shopify. Previously, Daniel was co-founder of Helpful, acquired by Shopify, Ripple, which was acquired by Salesforce, and WorkBrain, which was acquired by Infor. Daniel is an angel investor in 85 plus companies, including Wealthsimple, Clio, Ada, Clearco, Xanadu, and Ritual. He is an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto, director at Loblaws Company Limited, and a founding partner of the Creative Destruction Lab, Root Down Studios, and 42 Developments. Thanks so much for joining us today, Daniel. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So really excited to have Daniel on the program today. At the beginning of your career, you completed internships at Sullivan & Cromwell and Goldman Sachs, and you decided to decline offers to work at some of the most prestigious firms in the world to join a Toronto startup called WorkBrain. Why did you decide to join a startup after graduating with your JD MBA?
Honestly, the simple answer was it just seemed like a lot more fun. I had done these sort of fancy, summer job gigs, and yes, had opportunities to work at all these really prestigious places. But it just seemed like a lot more fun to be involved in building something from the ground up. And I can unpack part of the reasons why it seemed like it would be a good choice. It was a little risky at the time. It was a time, 2000. It was not like today where everyone was like, you should go join a startup. Most of my classmates thought I was completely crazy for turning down these opportunities. But the calculus in my head was, look, I got these jobs or I had these opportunities. I'm only going to be more useful or more valuable in a year or two if I go do this startup thing and it doesn't work out. Like I just going to learn some real world skills, and I can always go back and try and do these things. As you said, I had graduated with some degrees, and that was sort of like a safety cushion for me, I suppose. And the fun part was important because being a junior sort of peon at a big global law firm or consulting firm or investment banking is, prestigious, and they pay money that's pretty good. And joining a startup, which is what I got to do with people who I really, really respected, most especially David Oss and David Stein, who were the co-founders of WorkBrain, and they let me come on their team. I just knew I'd learn a lot more really fast by doing things, and it would be cool. It would just be a cool adventure. And then there was probably one other thing. Well, I'll relay a story. So when I was in California at school, I got to meet Peter Thiel. He wasn't sort of the Peter Thiel he is now. He hadn't even invested in Facebook yet. But he was still, like I knew him, he was the guy who had helped to found PayPal at the time. And he subsequently became a big investor in Ripple, actually, after that. But I remember meeting him, and in my first conversation, I realized he had also worked at Sullivan & Cromwell, the law firm I had worked as a summer associate, and he lasted 8 months. And so I asked him, I said, Peter, why did you quit after 8 months? And he had this great answer, which was, I wanted my life to be more stochastic. And that's, for you stats majors, that's sort of like a fancy word for just random. He wanted more randomness. And to take it a step further, he said, when I was at Sullivan & Cromwell, I could go out my office door and I could see the rest of my life. Like I could see what I would be as a second-year associate, a fifth-year associate, a sixth year, and then a junior partner and a mid-year partner. And I could see my entire path to making, senior partner money at this firm, millions of dollars a year. And for many of the people who were there, that was the greatest thing about it. It was just this consistent path of put your head down, do good work, and you're going to get there. And I no shame on that. I think it's great. But he's like, I didn't want that for my life. I wanted to not know what I was going to have happen when I woke up in the morning, and wanted to be part of a great adventure. And I completely resonated with him. And it was exactly why I was like, okay, yeah, no, I think that's exactly similar reasons why I made that choice.
I think that's such great advice. And in particular, I was thinking of Nassim Taleb's famous book, Anti-Fragile, and talking about the importance of embracing kind of randomness. And I think particularly in this century, and given the amount of instability and uncertainty that exists in the world, it's important to foster careers that don't run away from uncertainty, that actually embrace that uncertainty and that randomness. What were some of the key things you learned from your JD MBA program that you apply within an entrepreneurial context as a founder?
First is you do not need a JD MBA to be an entrepreneur. You don't even need a degree to be an entrepreneur. And I, as much as I'm a big supporter of education and doing it for its own purpose, it doesn't have to be instrumental, like a means to an end. So I think I should get that out of the way. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing to do or a waste of time. So what did I get out of it? I mean, the first is I kind of just enjoy the intellectual pursuit of learning things. I think there's some value in that. And if you like that, it's really useful. I thought the people who were unhappy with me at school, like didn't take any joy in that. And I thought it was a real shame because, hey, there was just interesting things to learn. The second thing that I think I learned is, to a certain extent, business school teaches you a toolkit of like how to do a DCF and what does cost of capital mean, and, just how different participants work in the financial markets and the business market. And, you can learn a lot of that online, but I think there was value. But the other thing I got was a great network of friends. Like, and I don't want to undervalue that. And many of those friends are people that I still interact with on a daily or weekly basis. And so I think there was real value. I think the law school part was also really helpful. I think definitely you, as a founder, you bump into legal issues and legal things all the time. And so it sort of helps to have some understanding of what the heck is going on. Well, I learned this lesson that like, if you wanted to get an A in law school, if you wanted to get a B, you would articulate, like you get a case and they say, here's your exam question. And you would argue one side of the case really, really well. And if you, if you really want to get an A though, you had to be able to articulate, here's exactly why, this side wins, and then go and be as convincing and as emphatic arguing why the other side should win. And that's a really powerful skill as an entrepreneur, to be able to think about both sides of things equally at the same time and sort of understand that it's not about just one answer. It's sometimes about unpacking both sides of it, really thinking things through. And then probably the other thing is you start thinking about risk and understanding risk, and not that, to your point, risk is not something to run away from. It's just something to manage and hedge. And sometimes you want to take risks because there's these asymmetric upsides. So I'd say that definitely those are a few of the things that I took away from law school and business school. I could go on, but those are probably the main ones: the toolkit, the relationships, and kind of this way of thinking about problems, I think.
The way of thinking, and I've never attended law school, but I heard that from many people who've attended law school, who've ended up going to do diverse career paths, is how law school just teaches a way of thinking that can be super helpful. And that a lot of people, it seems like there's a fairly large number of people who go to law school and then they graduate and they kind of are like, no way, I don't want to practice law. But going to law school was one of the best experiences of their life. There's a great podcast interview with Tim Ferriss and your colleague at Shopify, Harley Finkelstein, where he talks about his experience in law school, and it's kind of similar to one you described.
Harley and I both had a professor, but he was my professor at Western when I was an undergrad. He inspired me to go to law school, and he was Harley's professor. Unfortunately, he passed away. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being named Ian Kerr. So I totally heard Harley's podcast. I resonated with that a lot.
Another thing you said that really resonated, which I think is an important thing for all young people, even at kind of an elementary school, middle school level, to think about, is arguing both sides of an argument. And that we live in such a politically polarized world increasingly that I wonder if we got more young people to argue both sides or participate in competitive debate or those kinds of things, we would have a different system.
I think I posted that somewhere on Twitter, and someone said, yeah, we got to bring debate back, because debate teaches you, like, you don't get to choose the side. You just have to debate convincingly. And that's a skill in life, right? And it's not a skill of like how to debate. It's a skill of trying to see all sides of a fact situation or argument. I think the best entrepreneurs are ones where, like, okay, they can argue, here's why we should do something. And then they'll just say, flip, like, why do we do the opposite? Why don't I take the opposite side? Because through that process, you start to understand and see things from all sides.
It's a way to ultimately, when people think of synthesis, antithesis, and then kind of, what is it? I forget, Hegel's famous, was it? Yeah, dialectic, exactly.
Yeah, a dialectic. Yeah. Like in dialectic, yeah. There's these two opposing positions. Look, I think it was a really great, overall, it worked well for me, and it was a great experience. I even went back for graduate law school, right? Like I like it, and I teach a law school class right now. So for me, it was an interesting intellectual pursuit, and I really enjoyed learning. I like learning. Actually, there's one other thing that I think business school too, but law school was particularly good with, is most people think that going to law school is like you go and then you learn the rules. Like there's a rule book, like the criminal code or civil procedure, and you come out knowing the answers. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Like most people don't know, like there is no law. First of all, that's the other thing, is like the law is a judgment call in many cases, like when you ask your lawyer. But the other thing that you learn in law school is that once you have these basic skills of how to learn how to figure something out, what you learn is that you can figure anything out, right? They'll be like, do you know anything about the rules of, this secure transactions? Well, you don't. Go write a paper on it. So you're like, okay, well, I have to learn about this area of law. I'll go read the cases, I'll read papers, I'll like explore it. And by doing that repeated, you start to understand the most important lesson that you can get as an entrepreneur, or as a young person, which is you know how to figure shit out. Like you can learn things on your own. You don't need to have someone teach you. You can go read a book, learn the internet, and like over time you can discover and learn about a whole new area of or discipline. And that to me is the sustaining skill. That's the anti-fragile skill, which is like what you're good at is figuring things out. And you learn that in law school. If you do it properly, you're like, oh, shoot, I can learn about this thing by just reading about it, and I can understand it, and I can just keep repeatedly doing that. And so you start to become less fearless in my career. I'm like, well, I don't know anything about this space, but give me a few weeks and I'll go figure and learn about how to, at least enough about it to make a decision. And that is a very liberating and empowering feeling as a young person, to know that you're not limited by what your degree was or what you learned formally. Like, I don't know how to do that because I didn't go do product management, or I didn't go do account management, or I didn't learn finance. Well, like, bullshit. Just, you can figure it out. Go learn it.
Another benefit of law school, which is mentioned in that Harley Finkelstein interview, is around finding out the most important thing. So if someone's reading, 100 pages, and then there's a line that he references, I forget what it's called, but it's pulling.
Wacko Dickie Dende.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Or like, what's the ratio? What's the ratio? People would say, yeah.
Which I can imagine.
What's the essence of this case?
And I imagine in business, it's the same. If you're, for instance, you're on the board of Loblaw and you get a 100-page, board package with all these kind of material to pick out, okay, what are like the 2 or 3 things that matter the most from this 100-page document?
Yeah, finding salience. I mean, that's all true, except for like, I wish it was a 100-page board package. It's more like 600 or 700 pages. And yeah, that's exactly right. You got to learn how to like go through it all quickly and then be able to say like, what's the really important part here? Yeah, that's a very important skill.
Also on the topic of kind of large companies, you have been a part of selling 3 startups to large kind of global technology companies. What advice do you have for entrepreneurs who are looking to potentially have their companies be acquired and kind of go through that acquisition process?
I'll tell you, I was on the phone this morning with a founder, and he was asking the same thing. Should I raise money? Should I go sell the company? I think the best advice I could try and give is that you have to make those decisions based on what is important to you. At the end of the day, founding a company is about self-actualization. Like, people who think it's about making money, it is, but it's not the greatest path to making money. There's a lot more secure and less and risk-adjusted better ways. Like, you're doing something more than just try to make money. You're trying to put something into the universe. You're trying to build a product. You're trying to build a community, organization. You want to make your dent. You're self-actualizing. Like, all these things happen. And in sort of like any other financing choice, people ask, well, how should I raise money? I'm like, well, why do you want to raise money? Like, what is your goal here? What are you trying to achieve? And so the same thing with M&A. I think it's really important to think about, what is your end state goal of what you're trying to do here? Are you trying to protect your employees? Are you trying to hedge off against competition you think is going to come? Are you trying to get a big payday? Are you going to be happy working at the acquirer for a period of time? And I think a lot of those are very personal decisions, and there's so much pressure outside in the world of like what you're supposed to do. And sometimes you just need to take a step back and say, no one else can answer for you what the right thing to do is, of whether you're going to sell or not sell, or how to go through it. You have to do it. I think the other piece of advice I'd give, this is probably a good piece, is that like, it's a mistake to think that a big company buys you. Like, that's what you said. Oh, you were acquired by these companies. Well, like, no, I wasn't. A company is like a fictional legal identity that is created. every acquisition inside of a company is actually a senior executive who has authority to say, I'm going to make a bet on this team and this product or this company or this founder because they're going to solve a problem for me. And so you need to understand you're not acquired by a company, you're acquired by a senior executive or a CEO who has the authority and who believes that this deal will solve a specific problem. And so, it's not to say like you have to get to know those people. You have to understand why that is the right relationship that matters. And you have to know that you're going to be with those folks for some time to come, usually.
So if you're an entrepreneur and you made that decision where you want to sell your company in the next kind of year or two, what advice would you have on, and there's no inbound interest, let's say at this point, what advice do you have for an entrepreneur in terms of how to identify a potential acquirer and most crucially, to your point, build the relationships with the decision makers who can actually make the deal get done?
The identify process, I think, just comes naturally. If you're in a space and you're competing with somebody else, you're going to see these big companies or adjacent companies or people who logically you either compete against or you co-sell with in deals. And so I think that's the first one. You probably are going to know who the likely folks are. The second thing is to then think about how you can add value to that equation. So it might be like learning how to co-sell on a deal together or learning how to build a prototype integration of the technology. And the third part about sort of getting to know folks is exactly that. You should not feel shy, I think, to reach out and say, hey, I want to get to know you. You go to industry events, people meet up at those things. There's a networking process that happens. Obviously, if you try too hard to like get bought, it's going to be bad for you. It's not a great thing. But I don't think it's ever too early to build relationships and get to know the different people. Because again, it's going to be people. Like there's 6 companies who could buy you. Well, here's this. You should know your job as CEO, I think, is not necessarily that you're going to do it, but if you want to get bought, okay, that your job then is to know those 6 people and know how you would solve a problem for them. Usually in technology from a product perspective, right? So when we went in to meet Mark Benioff and talk about what Ripple could do with Salesforce, like we had mocked up screens of like, this is how our product will look like, integrate. This is the product vision we have of how this looks like inside Salesforce. So he didn't have to imagine that. We were like, here's what we're going to go do. This is what we think we can achieve together. And so I think that was a very effective, helpful thing for us to do.
Yeah, I think that advice is very resonant. One thing that in particular that I picked out is building those relationships early. There's a great blog post by Mark Suster on both sides of the table where he talks about how people invest in lines, not dots. And to the point being that the earlier you can build, most people, to Daniel's point, like, who the potential acquirers likely are. How can you build those relationships as early on? So it's not just, over the period of a couple months you're having conversations, but it's potentially over 3, 4, 5 years, not necessarily all about perhaps acquisition, but just building that relationship kind of over time.
Yeah. And affinity, like that's the other thing. And remember, most acquisitions are like, we're hiring you. So like, like they need to believe that you're going to be the person who's going to help them solve that problem that they have internally. That's a good point. I mean, I think there's another point, which is like, the best acquisitions, the ones that get the highest prices, those are companies that are not sold, they're bought, right? There was no process. No one was trying to sell. Like someone came in and said, like, I need you so badly that I'm willing to pay this premium to do it. And I'd say that's probably the best strategy. I'm not sure I've always done it the best way, but like, by just not responding to that, having a vision of what you want to do over the long term. It goes back to like, what are you trying to achieve here? If what you want to do is build something great, you don't waste your time on that. Like just keep your head down and keep building, go build a great product, build a great company, build a great team. There will be lots of opportunities along the way for someone to try and acquire you. And it's far, far better to be in a situation where you're like, nah, I'm not interested in selling, thanks very much, than like, hey, can we work something out? It is a far better negotiating position. And it's also like consistent and true with what your long-term goals are, which is to build a great company.
One thing I bookmarked that you said earlier, 1 or 2 questions back, which is about self-actualization, and that a lot of entrepreneurship is about self-actualization. To you, Daniel, what does self-actualization look like in your own personal kind of like context?
I think the point is it is self-actualization. Everybody figures out their own thing. But for me, it was always like having fun, getting to work on fun projects, getting to learn new things all the time, having a sense that I was having impact on the world by like, creating or inventing new products. There's something cool about working on an idea that then becomes a real product or a product category that people use in a different way. And then heavily, it's also about human beings. Like, can you create a thing that other people get to build and grow upon? Their life gets better. They get to develop. I I was really excited. I just was a colleague of mine from Ripple joined us at Shopify, and I was super excited. And he was reminded me that he's like, don't you remember that you actually saw my CV and you paid for the lawyers to have me move to Canada to come join Ripple? But he's like, well, that opened up a whole life for me. I got married here. I've had kids now, and my career. And then we went to Salesforce, and Salesforce was this amazing experience for us because we went there. And like, that's super gratifying. That is incredibly self-actualizing if you, through your actions, can help other people.
And I agree. To the point about self-actualization, the definition, each person has their own definition, or their own, not definition, own kind of image of, I think, what the self-actualized person. But I think your answer is one that would resonate with a lot of entrepreneurial people. Ultimately, it's kind of what do you leave behind? What's the positive impact that you have on other people? Or even sometimes to think of, it's like that movie It's a Wonderful Life, where if you were never born, how would the world look kind of differently? And I think that's what a lot of entrepreneurs and founders are motivated by. It's that desire to really make an impact on the world and to positively impact others.
That I'd say that being at Shopify has really reminded me of and increased in me. And you mentioned Harley; he's an inspiration, a friend, and really practices this, which is growth. The thing about a startup is you grow. You have to grow, or else it's not going to work. You have to get better. You have to get better at managing people. You have to get better at interacting with people who disagree with you. You have to get better at spotting trends. You have to get better at negotiating. You have to get better at motivating. Like, just everything has to keep getting better every year. And to me, that's a really sort of fun feedback loop to get involved in, right? That you can do stuff and you constantly are growing. Shopify for me has been a huge growth experience, right? I think that's one of the reasons I love it so much, is that me and everyone around is just constantly pushed and then given the tools to get better and improve your game and get better every year. In aggregate, as everybody's doing that, then the company is getting better. So I think that's a lot about self-actualization. There's a line that Toby has, I think it really struck me. He said, like, the definition of hell is like looking back on your life and realizing something like, of all the things that you could have been, that you weren't what you could have achieved. I think that's a pretty apt thing. You want to look back and say, like, no, I really left it out of the field. I tried my best. That's part of the self-actualization of an entrepreneur, I think.
One of the things in terms of Shopify's culture, there's two things I kind of want to sort of talk about that I've read about. So first is the concept of requalifying for your job each year, and that's one thing that I've read within the context of Shopify, which is that constant emphasis on personal growth. The second thing that I find really interesting is the in-house coaching that Shopify does for executives and the significant investment that Shopify makes. So kind of in general, can you talk a little bit about your experience with those two things, the requalification and then the use of internal coaches for executives?
I think the requalification thing is an explicit expression of what many places have implicitly but don't talk about, and they should. What Shopify's done is said, you have to keep getting better. You have to keep growing. Stasis is not an option, because, like, if the whole business has to keep getting better every year and keep growing, then the business, so remember what I said earlier, like, the company is just the people, I mean, the code, right? And so you have to keep getting better at it. And I think it's just sort of embedded in the culture. There's no like 40% meter. Like, that's not how it works. No one's like, oh, you were 22% better this year. That's not how it works. I think it's just a mindset. It's a marker to put out to everyone to remember that you're not just here to do your job. You're here to get better at doing it and to stretch yourself. And it's a mindset of growth. It's a growth mindset. There's a great book. If you're a parent, it's a great book. It's called Mindset by Carol Dweck, who's a psychologist at Stanford University. And she did a series of experiments that just showed really divergent performance around people based solely on their mindset. And it was the difference between a fixed mindset, which is like, I have a set of skills, this is who I am, and this is what I'm good at, and I'm not going to get better at anything, right? And that conclude, like, I'm very smart, so therefore I have to be good at stuff, and if I'm not good at it, I'm not going to do it. Versus a growth mindset, which is like, hey, I can get better at stuff. I'm good at learning. And I think I alluded to this earlier when I was talking about like why I was trying to go to the startups, because you have to be in that growth mindset where you're like, I'm going to try and take feedback. It might be painful, but I'm going to learn from it. I'm just going to keep trying to improve my game in every facet of what you're trying to achieve so you can be really great at it. So I think that's how the mindset, that 40% better, it's really the embodiment of Dweck's growth mindset, and how do we get everybody to be in that place to know that we're not fixed in our capabilities, that we can stretch and continually improve. In terms of the coaches at Shopify, I would just say, like, someone will write a book about how differently this company is managed. It is so different from other tech companies that I've been part of in such a pleasant way. I mean, it is different, but it's wonderful. And one of the examples is the coaches, right? That having a full staff team of coaches who are there for people to help them learn, who understand the context of Shopify. They're not just random people on the outside giving you sort of canned advice. They really understand how Shopify works and what are the expectations. And then they're very caring and tailored. And I worked with a coach that we had that was made available to me, and I'd say it like saved me, because I had some bad habits. I had some bad mindsets. And, having a coach, Gregor, work with him on a weekly basis for a period of time really made a difference. And it was probably one of the best perks that one could ever have in a company, was someone who was there to not be your manager, not be your not be there to let's talk about how you're doing, but let's talk about your deadlines, but just really talk about like how you're doing, how you're interacting, and how you can become more effective. So it's part of the secret. It's not a secret anymore, but it's definitely part of the secret weapon, I think, of that makes Shopify such a special place, is all the coaches.
Parents are in some ways a kind of coach in some kind of context. And you're the father of 4 kids, all who are, I think, relatively kind of young. And to the point of what you talked about earlier about mindset and kind of Carol Dweck, what advice do you have on how parents or guardians can foster a kind of entrepreneurial mindset in children?
Cool. Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I don't know. My oldest is 11, so like maybe I don't know whether this is going to turn out to be good advice. Like, who knows? Maybe I'll raise a bunch of bums. I don't know. but okay. Well, the book Mindset's really great because it has some practical advice too. And one of the great pieces of advice it says is do not compliment your kids on their fixed characteristics. So you never say to a kid like, you're really smart, right? You'd say you're good at learning stuff, right? That's probably one. The second is to really focus on the idea of failure is how you learn, right? And so there's a great example of the growth mindset. Like, if you're okay, if you know that you won't be good at something at first, but you're comfortable with it, right? If you have then when you don't do it well, what you do is you're like, well, you analyze and then adapt, right? You're like, oh, okay, well, what didn't go right? Let me try it again. Let me try it again. But each time you're getting information back in that feedback loop. And if you have a growth mindset, you're okay with not doing well. So you'll just keep getting better. Whereas fixed mindset people, you're like, I am very smart. I'm very smart. Well, I did this thing and I didn't do well. Therefore, I must not be very good at it. So I'm not going to try it. And that cuts against some of the stuff that I was talking about earlier about like learning that you could figure stuff out. So I think as a parent, like, what do I talk to my kids. I'm like, if you're not willing to suck at something for a while, you'll never be good at it. Right. And so, like, just a few weeks ago, we were out and kids were trying to learn how to do, water skiing or something like that. I'm like, you just get ready. You're going to fall a lot, and that's going to be great. It's okay that you're going to fall a lot. And I try to do that as much as I can. And then I suppose on an entrepreneurial basis, like, encouraging people to tinker, just to try things. I try to do that them all the time. They're like, let's go do this thing. My daughter's downstairs making paint right now. And she's like, I think the one who just came in, she's like, I want to make paint. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. How are you going to do that? And she started to tell me, I'm going to go try and get some berries and some leaves, and I'm going to get a rock and grind it up, maybe add a little water. I'm like, well, let's see what happens. Let's experiment. And so, like I said, I don't know if I can teach anyone to be entrepreneurial, but those are some of the things I try to do with my kids.
I think those are great pieces of advice. And I think to the point about emphasizing the journey, not the outcome, I think is so important. One thing that I've observed with Venture for Canada and working with a lot of recent like kind of Gen Z, is a kind of epidemic of perfectionism. And perfectionism, one of the things that's interesting is that it's often linked with placing kind of the converse of what Daniel said, which is placing a lot of emphasis on the outcome and really fixating purely on the outcome and not on the journey and kind of the learning experience. And unfortunately, I think that we're having, amongst a lot of recent grads, there's an epidemic of perfectionism because society has placed huge emphasis more on outcomes than on learning kind of journeys. And it's super important, I think, for developing that entrepreneurial mindset of really focus on what you learn on the journey and not just on what the outcome is going to be.
Yes. I mean, I don't want to like, sometimes they've got to like the cult of failure where it's like, oh, failure's good. I'm like, no, failure sucks. It's really not fun, but it's part of the process, right? So you can't hate it. You have to expect it, and then it's going to happen. I mean, even on the perfectionism or trying to know everything, like that's just not how people know things. Like you can't know everything. Just sort of think about it for a second. Like you can't know everything. It's just impossible. And so the best you can do is know a little bit and then kind of move a little bit forward and then kind of move a little bit forward. It's funny, when I was running a startup, I used to describe this thing, and then I found that like Toby uses a similar metaphor, so I was quite pleased. Of like in video games, when you have these like kind of role play games, one of the things you used to do is like there's a map, it's usually dark. And so one of the key strategies is just run around and see how to light up the map so you know what's going on. You can sort of imagine like that's what you're doing in a startup, or that's what you're doing in life. You're like running around trying to light stuff up and see where things are. But then you go back and now you've had a much better view of the world because you've tried lots of stuff. You're like, okay, well, that's the path I'm going to go. That's what I'm going to go try and do. And I just think you're going to have a lot more options if you're willing to try, right? If you're willing to try, but you're not going to be willing to try if you expect to be perfect every time. Like I said, if you're not willing to suck at something for a very long period of time, you will never be good at anything. It's just not possible, right? Like and back to the kids thing, like I make a point of talking to my kids about what I suck at and like what I'm trying to get better at. Like and that's okay. Like I kind of want to model that like being crappy at something is not some sort of moral failure or sin. It's just part of the journey and something to just accept, right? And it's also good to be good at stuff, but you didn't get there automatically. It just, the only way you got there was by trying things many times.
Constant experimentation. And to the point about kind of the glorification of failure, I agree. I think that it's, in terms of embracing the journey rather than the outcome, it's as much, I think, about embracing the uncertainty of the outcome. That sometimes I think in the sense that the outcome is, and in anything it's uncertain. There can be many different kinds of success, or what success looks like. There can also potentially be failure, but emphasizing that the sometimes pain and mistakes and all the things that go into building something greater, to build to become world class at something require ultimately in some ways it's about asking the question of like, what pain are you willing to accept, right? And that's a degree of.
It's also like, how do you react to stuff? Like, my first boss, the founder of WorkBrain, David Ossip, all sorts of crazy shit happened in building that company. So many challenging things happened. And David uniformly, when something like just sort of like just out of the blue, random, like 9/11, SARS, all sorts of shit happened to us, he would just sort of calmly sit there and he would be like, unlucky. Okay, what are we going to do now? And I just saw that, like, it was so powerful, right? He was like, what he meant was like, shit happens. That's unlucky. Okay, well, we can't tear our hair out forever and be sad and complain about how unfair the world is. It's like, we know what happened, and now what are we going to do? And that's a really powerful model, because I do see people who like, they just fall apart when something unexpected happens. But like, to your point about being anti-fragile, like if you're used to unexpected thing happening because you put yourself in that situation again and again, you learn how to react with, well, unlucky, and then what are we going to do now? Kind of be sanguine about
Agreed.
it.
And I think that comfortableness with uncertainty and randomness is actually something that can be fostered over time. I think it is like a competent, I don't think it's just innate, although I think to some extent, certain people have more of a tendency to it than others. But the more that we try to protect people or try to run from randomness, ironically, the more that we actually make people vulnerable to uncertainty. In kind of closing, Daniel, one question that we love to kind of ask guests to kind of reflect on is, if you could go back in time and give advice to your 22-year-old self, what advice would you say, and why?
I think I had two pieces of advice. One, which I might have been able to take. One, which I probably still wouldn't take, because it's constitutional, right? Which is like, constitutional. Just don't be so nervous and anxious all the time and worried. But like, I can't help it. That's who I am, and it's part of the secret sauce, I think, right? Like this desire to get better, to grow, and like that can be exhausting, and frankly, exhausting for the people around you. But you don't always need to have that all the time. Like, it's going to work out. It's going to be okay. I'd probably say be more patient. Like, I think I was, and I still am, an impatient person, and you need to have patience and foresight to see these things through. Like, it takes a long time to build a company, to build a career, to build skills, to build relationships. Having the patience. And then the third piece of advice, probably, and this I would have been able to take, and I would encourage, is that like, there are windows of time when you can kind of go do different things. They were like, after school, I went traveling for a while, and I went with my now wife. We went traveling for a bit, or I was at school in California. Like, there's all sorts of these moments, like in your life, when you have you're doing something different. Go get to real work and go get to do that. And you know what? I would say, I always look back and I'm like, why didn't I travel for 2 more months? Or why didn't I go do this for 3 more months? It would make no difference in the scale of things in my life. It wouldn't have made any difference, but those were such wonderful and fulfilling and enriching experiences. And you can't get them back, right? You get, more encumbered, shall we say. I have 4 children, I got a job, I got responsibilities. It's a lot harder to just go off and go backpacking. And so, I wouldn't say just do that forever, but when you're sitting there and you're like, oh no, I got to get back because I have to get started on my job. I have to no, be patient. You got time. Go enjoy yourself. Like, have fun. Like, and that's the advice I would continually try to give to myself.
Be patient, I think, is great advice for people just starting their career. It's something I've noticed a lot with different Venture for Canada fellows, and I think is something that is highly resonant. Also, I think on the piece about worry less, I think is an important one. Certainly one I'm trying to work on in different kinds of ways. You tweeted a great thing, I think it was late last year, where you talk about how, and I remember it stuck with me, is you said anxiety it can be like a superpower for a lot of really entrepreneurial people. But the key is not going to the dark side, where it can and I think, and certainly at times, something I have struggled with, I think a lot of entrepreneurial people, is anxiety is a fuel, but it can also then become a hindrance, and it's figuring out how to manage it.
100%. It is an adaptive behavior that can become maladaptive if it gets into a negative feedback loop. So you need to maybe that's another piece of advice I would have given myself, is learn how to meditate a lot earlier on. And I can't pretend that I have the best practice, but it is a skill that helps you a lot, because you start to become connected of how your emotions change your physical, like you actually have a somatic experience. You can feel that happening before you get anxious or before you get nervous. And so you can get into really negative feedback cycles. And if you get good at controlling it, it can be positive and adaptive, but if it's not, it can be pretty shitty. So that's definitely a good thing to learn about.
Daniel, it has been a true pleasure. Every time I chat with you, I learn different things, and we've had a fascinating conversation about everything from Carol Dweck and mindset theory, the kind of parenting, talking about your kind of early experiences with WorkBrain, and now your experiences with Shopify and Shopify's culture and the coaching programs that they have in there. Really appreciate all of your support and guidance and mentorship during my journey with Venture for Canada. It's been a true pleasure having you on the show. Thanks for coming on. That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stirrett, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.